today's current gaming landscape of loot boxes, inflated AAA budgets, and huge publishers, plenty of discussion has been devoted to how video game companies make money and the realities behind the $60 price tag. But a little bit less time has been devoted to the subject of why video game companies are making some of the microtransaction gameplay decisions we're seeing them make as of late. Sure, we know that they're always trying to make more money, but that's just barely scratching the surface and leaves many gamers with legitimate questions, like, aren't there other ways to make money than live service games? Couldn't they just make smaller titles that appeal to less people rather than fewer titles that appeal to more? And why are so many video game companies using greedy tactics rather than focusing on unique gaming experiences? Can't they just, make less money and still be happy? The answer is actually, well, no, they can't, because typically major video game companies and major companies in any industry aren't set up in a way that allows them to do anything else except chase the almighty dollar in basically any way they can. Unfortunately, many of the companies calling these shots, well, they kind of have to be greedy if they want to keep their jobs. If you've ever wondered what the heck it means when people talk about investors, boards, share prices, and other super exciting business terms, we thought we'd break down what roles those play in the world of gaming, how they drive a lot of decisions about the type of games you can play, and how it all influences the industry. That's right, boys and girls, and everything in between, it's business time. And before we get started, it's important to note that this isn't a defense of why companies choose to operate in these ways, it's just an explanation. The first thing to understand about what drives video game publishers and developers is that there are basically two types of companies that exist in the marketplace, those that are privately held and those that are publicly held. Private and public denote whether or not the company's owners, or shareholders as they're referred to in the business world, are a small group of private individuals or the general public. In each case, ownership of a company is divvied out in shares, and the percentage of the total shares that you own dictate how much of the company you own. In the case of a private company, these shares are typically only held by a small amount of people, for instance the founders and maybe some financiers who came on to pump some money into the company early on in exchange for some ownership of the company if it ever got big, aka an investor. We'll come back to investors in a minute because they are super important in the case of understanding what drives the decision making in public companies. So, in a private company, this ownership is fairly self-contained and, in a sense, answers mostly to itself and a very limited amount of people. Some examples of privately held companies in the video game industry that operate on a AAA scale include Valve, Bungie, Bethesda, and CD Projekt Red. There are some benefits to being privately held. For one, the founders who held the original vision typically get to call a few more of the shots than they would in a public setting. But it is worth mentioning that there is accountability there from the other shareholders. But in general, they get to be a bit more flexible in the short and long term because their focus isn't necessarily all about increasing the value of the company, which is why some of the names that we listed, like Valve, Bethesda, and CD Projekt Red, for instance, can afford to experiment a little bit more with their games. And in the case of Bethesda and CD Projekt Red, focus more on single-player titles that don't have quite the money-making potential of their live service counterparts. Bethesda, in particular, is a bit of an anomaly in the video game world and one of the few major publishers that is still privately held. As such, it is kind of easy to see how they've crafted an identity for a particular type of game without as much outside pressure to change things up. Of course, there are some downsides to being privately held as well, and most of that has to do with the amount of money you have to expand and do new things. One way to quickly inject a lot of cash into your company is to go public, which is when you offer up shares and ownership of the company, well, to everyone else. At this point, the valuation of the company is determined, and based on the number of shares, each share is given a specific value of its own. Then the public buys up shares if they're interested. So now people are putting way more money into your company than you had originally. But the downside is that now they get a say in what your company does, because instead of just answering to yourself and your initial investors, you're now answering to loads of investors and shareholders. And since they're investing with the hopes of making some money when the valuation of that company rises, that means your most important goal, instead of just making some awesome video games, is now making short-term profit. Because once your company is public, your primary job is to increase share value, which, as you can imagine, is going to change some things about what decisions you make and how your company is run. And there's not really much you can do to be immune to that, because once companies go public, the investors get to change even the structure of your company. So enter the board of directors. This is how the public shareholders get a say in what you do. They elect board members to represent their interests and make important decisions about the company's direction. And the board of directors generally has quite a bit of power. They vote on major company issues and they make important personnel decisions such as, who runs the freaking company as the CEO. Of course, shareholder representatives aren't the only people on the board. They're made up of inside directors and outside directors, those within the company and those without, who aren't involved in the day-to-day operation. And it's this dynamic that makes some of those questions we asked earlier a bit more difficult for a gaming company. If a CEO decides, you know what, making this type of single-player game that doesn't sell as well in the marketplace is really what our team wants to do, and we're okay with not pulling in as much money as last year's title, well, guess who's gonna get replaced by the board of directors if that game fails or doesn't make as much money for all of the company's shareholders? While the company is still free to act on its own, as long as it's public, it's ultimately going to answer to that board, who is answering to the shareholders. So the do we have to make as much money as possible question isn't one that's going to get asked. If you're a publicly traded company, no other answer is going to be acceptable. And this is why privately held companies can take some of those risks. Obviously, their goal is to make as much money as possible too, but they don't have to worry about pleasing somebody outside the company, just doing what they want to do, keeping the lights on and making more money. While there are plenty of developers out there who are privately held, sometimes their hands are just tied in certain matters because of the deals they make with their publishers, who themselves are often publicly traded. And that's the case with groups like Bungie. They're a private company, but their Destiny deal with Activision is going to no doubt leave their hands super tied in certain matters. Nobody knows the ins and outs of that deal, but there are probably some things regarding live services and business models that came from above. As publishers are the ones fronting most of the cash to get a game made, you can bet that they're going to want to call a few shots about post-game revenue. Still, that's probably different for each specific case. A bigger developer with more hits on their hands probably has a bit more power in those instances. Since scaling up and growing is the main reason you'd want to become publicly traded, that means many of the privately held publishers out there are typically smaller. Probably the exception to that rule is somebody like Bethesda, who we already mentioned has definitely carved out their own identity in the industry. Again, this isn't really a defense of those tactics or how some companies choose to meet their goals, but it is an explanation of why many of them pursue above what some players want. Sure, they could make a little bit of money and make that single-player title you really, really want for small returns, or they could do the thing that they're on the hook for and make as much money as possible to answer to their shareholders and to their board. And for many of video game developers, that's a delicate balancing act, keeping customers happy and shareholders happy at the same time. On the one hand, you've got the gamers who pump money into your studio, and on the other hand, the investors who want even more of that money and can kick you out of your job if you don't get it done. Developers and publishers are constantly landing on the wrong side of this, as we've seen in numerous instances recently, but we've also seen them taking strides to make those things right. Well, in some cases at least. So now you know more about why some video game companies make the decisions they do, and guys, just be really nice to those social media managers out there. They're not making these decisions if it's mostly the shareholders, but for more informational breakdowns about the industry, remember to like this video, and if you're new around here, subscribe to The Know.